And maybe that's a point here, is that how do we create a culture and a language around the not the destination, but the enablement of those who can take us there.
Yeah.
Because that's much more compelling.
Today, we're going to be talking about how to operationalize good conversations. We've talked a lot about strategy in the changing world right now. And one of the big things that has come up time and time again is how do we put it into practice? I know that Adam has spent many years helping organizations build concrete strategies and give them advice on how to deliver them. And so maybe, Adam, you'd be able to just kick us off with a few thoughts from your experience in your career.
Yeah, not a problem. I think when it comes to operationalizing ideation, discussions, all the thinking, there's quite a mental challenge for some staff, individuals, leaders to take the conceptual and turn it into action. This is why we have things like planning. And one of the challenges with actually that translation from those early conversations to action is really one around almost planning can sometimes be a limitation as much as it is an enabler of that translation from kind of the ideas, the conversation into something real. A lot of planning organizations within companies and governments and everywhere in life, they have a tendency to err on the side of risk conservatism. And we'll have a good conversation about the role of risk and risk management and how we think about risk in this conversation. But I think where I would like to kind of start the conversation is really run around the complexities of taking what is into one head and turn it into something that is actualized and bringing people along for the journey. It's if I have a good idea and the three of us are in business together or a partnership and we want to go and do it, how do I make my idea our idea? How do I ensure that this is not command and control? How do I make sure I get the buy-in and the support behind the belief, the purpose of why we're doing this, and make it a collective idea as opposed to an idea that I might have come up with? And this is quite challenging, particularly if there is decentralized decision making, autonomous roles. It's this challenge how people, organizations employ smart people. However, we quite often get in the habit of telling them what to do as opposed to allowing them to do what is right based on the common goal. And this is that tension, command and control, decentralized trust for a common objective. I think that's probably where I'd like to start the conversation. How do we reconcile sometimes this bridge? Because when the bridge is a bit too far, people err on the side of conservatism, and then good, ambitious thinking becomes normalized and never really reaches its full potential.
I find that really interesting. The thing that was most striking for me, Adam, when you were speaking was this word, the sentence, like planning can be a limitation. And that's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? And it reminded me of one of the biggest principles in collective mindfulness. And that is, you have to be sensitive to operations. That means you have to be sensitive to what's going on the ground, as opposed to being the big strategist who makes a plan, who creates a beautiful diagram, and who says, this is where we will be, this is what we need to be thinking about in the future. And that sometimes removes people from the reality on the ground and from being sensitive to what's actually going on. And by sensitive, it's actually a literal word. It means sensing or checking what makes sense to people as they're doing things. So what I'm taking away from the first bit of what we've talked about is, if we want to operationalize, which is a terribly complex word in itself, right? If we want to turn something that's theoretical into reality, we need to do stuff as opposed to plan and talk, or maybe in addition to plan and talk, and move away from telling people what we think they need to hear, and maybe move more towards doing or trying out what might be appropriate, what might fit for the situation that we're finding ourselves in. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, so one of the words that really struck me in what you said, Adam, and then actually you kind of brought back to you nicely, was the use of the word translate. And big ideas get people involved. People want to jump on them. People want to go to the moon. They want to go to Mars. They love the concept of a moonshot. But when you start breaking that down into actually what does this mean? A central command and control hub can't possibly translate that into everybody's reality in an organization. And even a manager of a small team can't translate that accurately into what does that mean to every individual within that group. And so for me, I think part of this comes down to building a space where it allows people to understand the directionality of where somebody wants to go and what are the big milestones along a journey, or the stepping stones along a journey. Then allow people to make sense of it for themselves and almost build their pathways between those individual discrete. And it certainly wouldn't be unusual for big organizations that have big plans to only reveal parts of those plans, to avoid scaring people too much about that long journey that they are envisaging, but just about the shorter pieces that they're looking to achieve. Allows people to grapple onto those smaller changes and translate those smaller steps into something that's real, and then be able to plan for themselves how do they move along those journeys. But I think that process, as you highlighted earlier, Adam, it's that has to move from a command and control of the big idea through to very much a distribution of responsibility and trust for making the small changes that need to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the crux of where delivering any strategy or any big idea falls down, can fall down, is because you have to be able to translate and manage and put things in place so that people can have those very, very real discussions.
Can I pick up on real and on translating strategy into action, or making that gap work between knowing what you need to do and then doing, right? That all travels through the heart. That all travels through me viscerally feeling I'm engaged, feeling that I trust the two of you, feeling that I trust who we are and what we stand for. And in therapy, we often joke that the longest journey is from the head to the heart. So it's absolutely no use to use big words. Only when these big words viscerally make sense to me in my body and maybe in my heart, when I feel something, then I bridge that gap between intellectually knowing what I need to do and what my heart and my body actually wants to do. So I'd like to bring in emotions straight away to this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, within corporate speak, winning the hearts and minds is bandied about all the time. And that is done in various different ways, communication, town halls, posters, hats, cake, half an hour, blah, 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 all the things. However, there is another translation layer that once you win the hearts and minds, then you got to get the arms and legs to move in sync. And this is the strategy to execution work that there's lots and lots of literature on. And I think you've hit one of the nails on the head. It's how do we invoke an emotional response strong enough to have that translation in the individual do it? Is that communication? Is that culture? Is that carrot and stick? Is that autonomy? Is there a particular level of IQ, EQ that needs to exist for people to actually, quote unquote, get it and pick it up and run with it to do that translation? And I think that then links back to the communication of the purpose as to why the strategy is. It's almost like we need to ask people to do something like a benefit analysis, or even from a personal perspective. We're going to Mars. Great. I solder wires together. What is the benefit in this for me? It might be pride. It might be, I'll become a better solderer. I'm not too sure, but there needs to be some form of tangible output that makes its own small piece. And then the collectivism within the community who is then going out and bringing this idea to life to actually bind it together. And that's when you have, coherent teams, and that's when you have, better performance. And there's lots of literature around that as well. But I'm interested in the translation within. This is where, Jutta, I'll throw it back to you. Like, is there something about belief? Is it something else? Like, I think my question is, how does someone, what is the path, or what is the process of someone to actually believe something enough to act on it?
As you're talking, I'm writing down, the steps that we normally use when we design change programs that stick for organizations. And I think the first question that everybody who designs a change program or a training program is concerned with skills, right? Can I do it? Or if people can't do what you're asking them to do, skills training, easy peasy. And then maybe classic programs that help people bridge that gap between status quo A from status quo A to status quo B, say, do I want to do it? Motivation training, right? Am I motivated? Am I interested, right? But in most cases, in my experience, and I think in the classical training program design, people don't care enough about asking the question of, is it normal and is it right? And that hits your beliefs. Beliefs is a bit more complex than just believing that I have the skills, believing that I have the motivation to do it. There's a belief about, am I actually the freak? Or is it actually going to hurt me in my relationship to maybe my group and the world to do it? Like, for example, my teenagers, I think a very big question for a teenager is, if I do this, is this actually what other people do too? And am I going to be singled out as being the odd one out, right? And if you are too different from the pack, even if you can do it and even if you want to do it, you might not engage in doing it because it's not appropriate enough. It's not acceptable. It's not normal enough to the situation. And I think that's where we need to focus on, because that's more important than my individual motivation or my individual skills or knowledge to actually start doing something differently. Adam, you've got something.
Matt.
As I say, that brings us back to something I think we talked about last time, which is down to the narrative. And one of the big things that I'm seeing in the big endeavors that have brought about change, so whether that is creating a space race between the US and Russia so that there was the first person in space, then the first person on the moon, we can't allow our better rival to get there first. There's pride, there's a whole host of fear about being second. If you look at the pandemic, there's an external threat that we have to do something to change. The compliance with any of the lockdowns in the world would not have worked in the slightest had there not been an external threat that could then be that could then be used and a benefit of saving lives. And the narrative to me appears to be that for most of these change initiatives, if we're looking at operational new ideas, there's almost a threat of doing nothing. There's a threat of maintaining the status quo, because for most individuals, the status quo is a comfortable place.
Yeah.
I know what I'm doing. There is no risk involved in me doing what I'm doing. So it's not until you start saying that there is risk involved in doing what you're doing that you can actually look at a way of creating that motivation to lessen the risk and build a brighter future. So whether the risk of the company going out of business unless we make these changes, the risks, I think there's a real impetus of finding what's important right now. If you look at Elon Musk and his SpaceX, mission, if you will, to put people into space, go to Mars, the whole risk behind that is that he believes, rightly or wrongly, that we're going to use up everything on the Earth and that we're going to need to find another planet to live on. That's his belief. That's his fire. And the whole way that people are then investing and buying into that vision is the fact that, well, this helps mitigate some of that risk.
Yeah.
This gives us a more stable vision of the future, maybe.
In at least in the corporate world, the application of the burning platform is a cult classic. It's one that we go back to again and again and again. What is the cost of inaction? But the burning platform, there's different degrees of how hot the fire is, how much the platform is actually burning. If you come up with a hypothetical, then it's a hypothetical. And what people believe downstairs is that, well, this is a hypothetical. So they don't actually believe anything. And that pushes people towards, not buying into the execution. And then I also think there's, within that translation of using a burning platform, metaphor, is that someone who is told and explained what the cost of inaction is, what are we actually doing here? Is this optimization or is it transformation? Because this comes down to, again, particularly in organizations, last year plus or minus 3, incrementalism. This isn't planning. This is, just kind of tweaking the numbers, being like, oh, we're going forward to grow, optimize, shrink to profitability, whatever the, main, not main, but, whatever the kind of objective is. But this is where sometimes objectives speak louder than purpose. We want to go to Mars. Oh, yeah, but to go to Mars, we need to build cheaper rockets. Okay, so if we're all bought into cheaper rockets, but that is kind of the war drums that beat louder than going to Mars, then suddenly I just feel like a cog. Building cheaper rockets just means that someone else can make more money, blah, blah, blah. There's this, I definitely think there's something here in relation to Jutta's point, or to both of your points, in relation to what is the emotional aspect between believing something and how do we get to that true belief and the subsequent actions and kind of things that come from believing, versus transforming. We're making something better. We can see the good. This is great. Versus optimization. More of the same, usually for the benefit of someone else, not me. They have 3 very different emotive anchors. And that's where the communication and the culture, and I'm sure many other things you're just going to touch on, kind of come into play.
I'm thinking right now of 2 things that I think that prevent people from opening up. And so the first one is this continuum of, independent of how intellectually accurate the burning platform is, independent of how elegant the narrative is, if something inside me makes me be defensive rather than curious, like on that, on that spectrum, to the defensiveness end, rather than being curious and open-minded, then I will find all sorts of reasons to invalidate, the logic of narrative and of platform. And I think that relates to something that's not intellectual, and it's not something that we can address by talking or by finding arguments. It is something that is about tolerance of ambiguity, or not tolerance of not knowing. And I think we need to go there, so that why am I defensive? Why am I not open to hearing your side? I believe it's because I would like things to be simple. I would like things to be neat. And unless we help people almost see the reality that there's ambiguity and there's uncertainty in the status quo and in translating a new strategy into action, most people will sit in defensiveness and will stay put and use all their intellectual capabilities to, as I've said just now, invalidate all the good ideas that we have. So I think this closed-mindedness is a big problem that we need to discuss and that we need to tackle, because there's a perceived security in being defensive and in shying away from ambiguity as much as possible, because that feels threatening. What do you guys think?
Isn't that part of the human condition in general, though?
Yeah.
And I just question, because I'm not a psychologist, but if we do, try to avoid ambiguity, we try to avoid change, we try to avoid risk and danger as a default, at least. How do we, how do we move from avoiding to embracing? Are there particular conversations that you recommend people have? Are there particular tools and techniques and?
I think I think the simple answer is there's no one size fits all solution, but becoming aware of what is tends to make things less rigid, and becoming aware of what's going on is easier done when I look at other things or other people than becoming self-aware. But the more we have conversations about being open about what is actually going on, especially in terms of my emotional state towards what's on the table, what's intellectually on the table, the more it becomes normal. And this is where it goes back to this third reason why people are able to change. The more it becomes normal to then dwell in a state of, I don't know what the future will bring, but I'm okay about the uncertainty, and almost having opened up my stance of completely categorically no to a stance of maybe yes. But it can only happen through conversations about opening up to saying, this is really what's going on for us. And maybe then I become able to say, this is what's really going on for me. Where are you guys in this?
Yeah. I'm trying to operationalize this conversation. And what's coming to mind is the relationship of people with ambiguity and uncertainty. So, a lot of risk mitigation kind of stuff instantly lunges forward. But I think the big one is being able to quantify or understand my readiness to do what the aspirational conversation, idea, strategy is asking of me. And almost doing, like an internal gap analysis. Okay, so this is what I'm being asked to do. Whether I buy into it or not, I'm pushing that emotive side, that buy-in to the side for the moment. I'm looking for, how do I muster this internal grit strength in me to go off and, do what I'm being told to do. And again, I'm quite sure you have lots of information on this from your time working with the military, with the MOD. Being able to internally evaluate and remove the ambiguity from how ready are we to deal with this ambiguity. So I'm if I can't solve the ambiguity of going to Mars, can I solve the ambiguity of can we get to Mars? That's where I'm going. I'm thinking about it in forms of controllable, uncontrollable. And if I'm not in control of the decision of going and doing something ludicrously ambitious, I can control my ability to execute this ludicrously ambitious plan. And then maybe I can find buy-in in that, because if I know that I can, then I must. It's this kind of idea of contribution, of the value of my effort will make this ambition reality. And then I'm translating that anchor that's holding me back from going in and kind of completely buying into, let's go to Mars, let's go to Jupiter, well, let's do whatever. Yeah, hang on, guys. What can and can't we do? Once we understand what we can do, how far does it get us? Once we understand how much further we need to go, then we have the gap to go, okay, well, here's the ambiguity. How much of this is wishful thinking versus actually something we can pull off? And if we look at what we can't yet pull off, what do we need? How do we build it? How do we find it? Do we acquire it? Whatever it happens to be. And then suddenly we're operationalizing the ambition of the idea. And we're not talking about the credibility of the idea. We're talking about us being able to do it. And if we can do something ambitious, then again, we go back to the negative business case. Why shouldn't we do this? What is the burning platform if we don't do this? Do our competitors do this? Do we lose a competitive edge to another country? Whatever it happens to be. It's, I'm kind of taking the problem and I'm placing it somewhere else so that it can be solved between controllable and uncontrollable.
I'd like to go, I love what you're saying, that we need to go from uncontrollable to controllable, really. Is that what you're saying, Adam?
To remove ambiguity,
yeah,
yes.
And I love that you hesitated, because even when I said we can't really go from uncontrollable to controllable, it's impossible, right? Because we're talking about translating some new strategy into action. We're talking about something that's inherently not controllable, but maybe from having ambiguity and uncertainty to having a little bit more of a felt sense of certainty in the external uncertainty. I'd love to talk about single loop versus double loop learning. And I was just reminded of Chris Argyris, right? Old stuff that we've been talking about in Cranfield decades ago already. But Chris moved the reason why Chris Argyris's work about organizations don't learn, because they close the single loop. They only say there's a problem and I need to do something to stop that problem from happening, right? My thermostat is designed to, whenever the temperature gets below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the air conditioning kicks in. Single loop, but it doesn't question why it even kicks in at 70 degrees. It could be that it's winter and it will never even hit it. So the double loop learning is about questioning the assumptions that make that learning loop happen. And Argyris is wonderful in shifting the conversation from head to heart. One of the famous strategies that he has is to talk about the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the conversation. I'm not sure if you've done this at Cranfield or whatever, but it's a practical technique, Matt, that gets people to become aware of the stuff that's in the soup, but that they're not normally aware of, or that they're not normally talking about. The right-hand side of this exercise, and this is literally what Argyris was talking about in the 90s with executives in organizations, and he basically lamented, and he observed that in the 90s, these big business executives from big professional service firms were not learning the things that they need to learn. They were becoming defensive, and they were deflecting responsibilities to the organizations that they were advising. They were young, smart, they came from top universities, but whenever things got difficult, they were not willing to question the assumptions, the inferences, the premises for which, that were underlying their decisions and their judgments were made. And so he came up with a super simple strategy. He said, written exercise, write down on the right-hand side something that is difficult for you. Who says or said what? What happened? ABC. That's the world of observational facts. Left-hand side, write down the emotions that you are having or that you think that might be in the room. Write down any feelings that are not being expressed for fear of any kind. Write down the concerns. Write down the assumptions. And he did this, and this is one of his most famous ways to get from single loop learning to double loop learning. And that means making a change that actually sticks, because people were opening up to articulate the undiscussables, the things, Adam, you keep on saying, the things that are not mentionable and therefore not manageable. So brilliant.
I'm really glad that Fred Rogers keeps coming up every other episode.
Fred Rogers is coming back.
Bless Fred Rogers, what a champ.
So what I've been basically saying just now is I'm trying to get us to shift also our conversations from head to heart, like to say, what are the things that prevent us from knowing even, what advice we can give to people who want to translate strategy into action? My assumptions that it's always about head to heart, guys. That's my assumption. You guys need to question me about this, right? This is what we need to do to each other. Because I keep coming back to feelings and we're not brains on sticks, but it's probably my assumption. And it's not complete.
Yeah.
Right.
And that comes back, and that comes back to that, from hearts and minds to arms and legs.
Right. I love that.
And that's where a lot of the talent management disciplines lunge forward, and it's executive communications, it's purpose and buy-in, mission and vision and messaging, and I think it's also making people who are in these organizations or these teams valued, because sometimes the purpose is the holy grail. Great. But for this to be actualized, the Holy Grail is actually in you, because you are the ones who are bringing it to life. So it's not let's go to Mars, it's we can go to Mars. It's and maybe that's a point here, is that how do we create a culture and a language around not the destination, but the enablement of those who can take us there.
Yeah.
Because that's much more compelling.
Because all sorts of things come up for me when you say, let's go to Mars. All sorts of criticism, concerns, naysaying, fears are coming up for me. And that's where the gold dust of the implementation is in, if I'm allowed to. Because it could be that one of these 7 concerns, negative things that I have, could be a gold nugget that you need to think about when you, as you big strategists are coming up with the strategy, we need to go to Mars. And shifting the narrative to discuss the undiscussables effectively changes the narrative and makes it more whole, it makes it more real, and it makes it more embodied. And before I let you guys respond to me and tell me what I've missed, I'd like to bring in John Gottman's work in relationship management. So John Gottman is this cool dude with long hair who looks like a hippie, lives in Seattle with his wife of 30 odd years. They are this beautiful hippie couple. He's one of the world's foremost relationship counselors. And he came up with these 4 horsemen of relationship conflict. And he can predict whether people will divorce by watching 15-minute clips of how they talk about, shopping or whatever. And he's amazingly accurate in predicting whether couples will make it or will fail. Terrible. It's terrible. But the 4 horsemen are defensiveness. That means You don't like to talk about things that are uncomfortable. Criticalness. You criticize somebody for having an idea that's different from you. Stonewalling. Stonewalling is you just don't go somewhere. So defensiveness is like a mini version of stonewalling. Defensiveness says, I don't wanna talk about this because I'm comfortable. Stonewalling says it's just basically the glare. And the last thing is contempt. Contempt for stuff that comes from the other that you think is not valuable. And Adam, I'm bringing this back because it talks about valuing employees, valuing people. If I'm not showing you that I value where you're at with what I want to operationalize, I will never have a conversation. I will never win you. I will never be with you. We will never have a relationship.
Yeah, this is fascinating because I think I've heard Esther Perel mention this work as well, and I love that podcast. Like it's one of my favorite. Where do we begin? And I know that Esther is now stepping into the corporate psychology world and working with executives about this stuff. So her thinking and her work is kind of going to where this conversation is going, which is what can you learn from relationships in an organization to ultimately have them do whatever the thing is, overcome the challenge. So yeah, you've touched on something really, really valuable, what can be learned from relationship psychology in a context in relation to business, because ultimately humans are emotive beings. And particularly when it comes to communicating ambition and translating strategy to action and all of these sort of things, I think a lot of leaders lose that. The goal becomes more important than the people. So this is where we're kind of headed in the same direction. How do we make it about the people, not about the goal?
And you know what? I would wager, and I'm getting ready for you guys to shoot me down, it's because they're afraid of really hearing the criticism, of hearing the fears that either they have or other people have with their strategies. Like, why would you not want to listen? Why would you not want to hear other people's perspective on what's going on? So Esther Perel's work podcast is brilliant because she starts by saying just this in this brilliant French accent way. So, how's work? And it's literally just like 3.5 words. But so, how's work? There's so much stuff underneath that. There's so much about how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, where I want to go, what my strategy is, how I'm seen by others, how I will be remembered, how we are, whether you've got my back, whether I can actually even stand you, whether I think there's an edge between you and me when you say, Jutta, over to you, or whether there's no edge. There's so much underneath. And it's emotive. Much before it becomes intellectual. Matt,
for me, there's
getting off my pulpit.
No. For me, that brings me back to some of the work that Google did, which was looking at why projects succeed or fail. And you can look at what does it mean for a project to succeed or fail. But there was a huge piece of work that really showed that how safe people felt within the group had a huge impact on whether that project was going to be a success or not. Having played my a number of different projects, and every project is about making some kind of change, and you build a strategy, put together some kind of plan that tries the company both look at, shall we say, you put together many plans, you put together a business plan, you put together project plans. All of those are based on a set of assumptions. The set of assumptions that I think people rarely look at are so we build in assumptions about markets, about customers, about whether there's going to be a recession or, we obviously forget to ever include anything about pandemics happening and black swans, whatever but then we end up in a scenario where we forget to put in the equation, I think, our assumptions. And then when we're looking to implement, it's all too easy to look at, well, are we measuring everybody on this project using the same yardstick? Or actually have we different, are we all being pulled in the same direction, different directions? Are we measured using the same metrics? And what actually is important to those people? Do they even care about this? And I think if we can look at building safe places where people can feel heard and listened to and that they're cared for, actually the potential for a burning platform, a brighter future can actually be reduced, because actually it's just something fun that we want to do. There are a number of projects that don't need a burning platform. All they need is a group of people that can have fun doing it. This is going to be a fun exercise. We get to self-select who we work with, how we're going to go on the journey. We get to put our hands up, to offer to do certain tasks. And I think that that's missing within organisations generally. That we forget to build safe places, and that we forget to encourage the behaviours that encourage places being built. I don't know what, Adam, you may have seen this.
Yeah, there's a couple of things lunging forward. The big kind of flashing light I have going in my mind is this concept of hierarchical relationship.
Right.
Because if I'm being asked to buy into something, fine. If I'm being asked to buy in from something from my manager, from the SVP, from a CXO, am I doing it because I'm told, because I'm a subordinate, because of the hierarchical relationship? Is it better that I receive this instruction from a peer? If I'm an engineer in an oil and gas company, am I better to hear, this same message and how to execute it, and the empathy and the operationalization of this instruction, not from up, but from across? Because then I don't get this from above threat, where not naturally, but potentially naturally, the instant response is to push back on this. Like, I'm only hearing this because you want me to do something. Like, what do you want? And if there's a way that we can circumvent that, then we have social proofing. We have, we're coming at it from a different angle where it's more consumable, it's more believable. And if it's more believable and more consumable, I'm more likely to swallow it, accept it, and put it at the center of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Jutta.
This is fantastic, because we're trialing right now in the Navy with senior leadership a way of talking and relating to each other that is less hierarchical in an extremely hierarchical organization, where hierarchy gives certainty and structure, and where commands cascade downwards. So somebody who is higher up the hierarchy tells somebody lower down the hierarchy what's going on, maybe what to do. But of course, that doesn't completely work in the 21st century anymore, especially not now, as we're all exploding with complexity, and as everybody who's down in the hierarchy needs to be as switched on as people further up. So tell and command and control doesn't work. Matrix and mission control, asking for the input of everybody, is the right way forward. And it's actually quite technical to make that change. Oh, okay. I see you.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in a thought that's just gone bolting through my head, is
Tell
that
me.
if you're looking for the more democratic model, like, we're recording this at the start of June 2020, and look what's happening in the United States. This is a democratic model that's pulling itself apart right now. What is the relationship between the command and control versus decentralized, everyone buys in and owns their piece? Like it has to be, I don't know, what you just said and the news I've read this morning just kind of go and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Like, what is the critical factors that need to exist for this to be held together?
I'm violently agreeing with you because I believe mission command, or not mission control, mission command, as the opposite of command and control, is inherently full of trust and respect of the voices that are at the table. And I'm not seeing that in the news this morning. I'm not seeing that coming out of the United States in the last weeks. And I'd like to expand on that. So
Yeah.
what we're trialing on in a very hierarchical organization, where normally commands cascade downwards without a two-way street of dialogue, of toing and froing, feedback giving. It works based on two principles: running meetings by asking for everybody for their input based on the Google model that you mentioned, Matt, that you mentioned before, where you're saying everybody trusts that they have an equal amount of airtime, at least for the beginning of the discussion. And that speaks to the respect part of communication. That means if I know that I have 30 seconds or a minute of airtime, as much as everybody sitting around me, I am just as much respected as everybody else around the table. And so it moves away from the content of the conversation mattering as much, and it moves towards the process of how we're communicating matters as much for how I feel about who I am and how I'm perceived in the conversation. And that's a new dimension that we're trialing out in the Navy, and that seems to be interesting as fodder for discussion of how to move the Navy into the future. That's one element. So giving all the parties that are stakeholders in the design airtime that is as symmetrical, as equal as possible, allows people to feel respected, independent of what you do with the information that people share. And the other thing is that whilst people are speaking, we don't interrupt, we don't criticize, we don't defend, we don't stonewall in the moment of people speaking. It's a technical instruction. Do you see what I'm saying? You don't even need to do anything with the information, but that means it speaks to the trust that I'm allowed to exist. And it goes to a very basic need of me that that we actually do to each other really well, I find. Sometimes we interrupt each other, and I think when we interrupt each other, we non-verbally signal that we don't mean to be disrespectful, but we're just so excited to interrupt each other. But we, the three of us, have this sense that we get enough expression of ourselves, and you too allow me to make my argument independent of what you think of it, and you allow me to develop whatever the hell, if I were to be so rude, I express. And that makes me feel good, gentlemen. That makes me feel good in this conversation. And making these two elements of technical changes to the way we're running meetings in these training programs is provoking discussion about who are we in relation to each other, and who are we in relation to the subordinates below us and the superiors that are even higher up the food chain, that give us even bigger doctrine or gospel. And that's what shifts the rigid nature of communication and of identity in an organization that I respect very much, and that is actually very forward-looking, but that doesn't have a reputation for being forward-looking.
It's interesting. Many of the things you just said, Jutta, were absolutely fascinating to me. But it got me thinking about the change in the way that we value certain groups that's happened during this pandemic. Because you were saying about having a discourse meant that we would value people, and if we each have a specific amount of time set, or allow it to develop ideas and conversations and that shows that we value each other's opinions, and even if we disagree, want to add something, there is a value attached to what you're saying, as there rightly should be. If I look at what seems to have changed during this pandemic, there are a number of roles that we would take for granted as, well, anybody can stack shelves in a supermarket. Perhaps I know I've done it before. It's actually not quite as easy as before. Remember where things go and what I were going to, but it's not something you need to be very highly qualified to do, but it's not an easy job, especially not with the times. And then you look at the challenge of operating in the circumstances where there is the threat of an external viral threat for people walking around, and you also start respecting the workers more. People didn't necessarily pay as much attention to people in the NHS. Suddenly we have done, and this to me looks like there's been a change in the national narratives, if you will. The national narrative shifted from, almost over from being about a pandemic and people being too conservative with the way they're treating the lockdown, or too liberal, one way or the other, to instantly overnight there's a very different conversation talking about race relations and how should what role do the police play in keeping people safe versus them being seen as a threat. All of a sudden that narrative of one to the other has shifted. And I wonder if part of this whole equation is really the values and the ability to listen to what's important and why and why certain things happen. And certainly from the US media, I don't see any intention of listening. In fact, the news shows that I've seen everybody shouting over the top of each other. 12 on the screen, everybody has an opinion, everybody shouting on top of each other. There's no that, and around the world, it's almost like we have to be adversarial in our politics, adversarial in the way we define how companies work, because we want to beat another organization, whether that's by sales. We want to, we want to be bigger, the next, our biggest rivals. And I wonder if the reliance on, shall we say, militaristic or traditional militaristic language has moved us from being able to hold conversations, needing to be adversarial, and if that then destroys our ability to find safe spaces, or if it builds smaller cliques of safe spaces, I don't.
There's a whole lot here. This concept of equality is now lunging forward because there is this construct in my head that in most hierarchical structures, not all, but most, there is not a default position to listen. There is a default position, particularly in the West, there is a default position to speak, to tell, to know. Great example. I'm sitting in my office minding my own business. A staff member comes in with a one-page document. It's a memo. Hands it to me. It's something I'm not familiar with, I've never read, and it's a huge problem. I will read the document. I will then look up, and this person will be standing at the side of my desk, go, all right, Adam, so what do we do? And I'm expected to know the answer because I'm on the big bucks. I have the position on my business card, and everyone's looking at me to come out with it. It's this positive reinforcement that there is not the time to listen, to digest, to consume, to reflect. And that's in myself. Now let's put this in a team context. A lot of the kind of coaching disciplines are now starting to run forward. It's listening, supporting, challenging, stretching, but it's not telling. It's not, it's not mentorship. It's not consultancy. It's not your boss. It's questioning. And that's why, Jutta, to your example, the three of us work quite well. We get excited and we all have our things, but we're all going for the common point, which is to move the discipline forward, which is to understand what is really going on, the strategy behind. Like, we're digging deep to go, what are the drivers? And then take those drivers and then try to give our good viewers here some information to have better conversations, take better actions, make better decisions to hopefully make the world a better place and their lives a better place. And it's this point that you both touch on in relation to hierarchy trumps equality.
And it's the other way around.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what if we actually kind of flipped it?
Yeah.
But this, I don't know if this is a lot of the thinking that went into, let's flatten the organizational structure and we're all even. And that's a kind of a swing at it, but I don't think potentially it's good enough in relation to what we're going for, which is ultimately turning ambitious ideas into executable initiatives to do amazing things. Jutta.
I find, by the way, the UK Armed Forces to be much less hierarchical in spirit and much more future forward-looking than private industry I have encountered, even though their reputation is hierarchical, stale, old-fashioned command and control. But that's just by the by. The thing that is in the spirit of what we're talking about today, which is like to operationalize ideas, is, Adam, you've said the idea of equality, and Adam, you keep Adam and Matt, both of you keep saying that we want to help people feel that there's equality, that there's airtime, that there's democracy. How do you translate this into an operational reality? You stop talking when you finish talking and you allow somebody else to have as much airtime as you do. And do you know what that means as well? We need to now do something with ourselves while we're listening. So it's brilliant that these new coaching programs and these new initiatives are coming up to say we need to do more listening. We need to ask more questions. And by the way, Keith Grint, when he talked about wicked problems and about how to deal with uncertainty, he already told us what to do. He said, we can't bark out commands. You do this when you have a critical situation, when something is burning, when it's completely clear who's in control, right? Somebody barks an order, somebody else says what to do. But when you have wicked problems where you don't know the answers, you as a leader don't tell, after reading the one-page memo, what to do. You ask a question, because you don't, by definition, know all the other dimensions of the wicked problem. So you have to use soft power. You have to be collaborative. You have to be equal and look for the cleaning lady, because the cleaning lady might know something that you don't know. But to operationalize this, what do I do with myself while I'm sitting in silence myself? I'm uncomfortable with silence. I am trained to tell you. I have got rewarded for 25 years for being the loudest voice in the room, for being the most eloquent speaker. What do I operationally do with myself as I am trying to listen to Matt and Adam saying something? I sit and say to myself, I notice that I'm feeling uncomfortable. I realize that something inside me is really irking me. I recognize that this is really hard to do. And I can do this in my head. I can do this to myself, but I can even do this to you. We can do this to each other. We can say, I notice that there's something going on, or I notice that Matt hasn't spoken. And that means I actually do something with my body and with my mind to make space for listening, to make space for questions. I need to now shut up and talk to Matt. Matt, what do you think?
I think it's important to make space for sure. By the way, I've just been fascinated by the conversation, so I've just been listening and not about trying to get jump. For me, I think the one thing that we probably haven't touched on today that I think is really quite important is being able to not just go to that's safe, but it's within that safe, being able to touch on things that are uncomfortable, the uncomfortable realities about the situation. And if I look at typical greetings between human beings, so hi, how you doing today? Good, thank you. Shake hands. You say hello. It's the surface level of the general interaction between people is pretty superficial. We get used to living busy lives and not necessarily wanting to engage at anything more than a superficial level because we're so tied up with that we feel is important to us, our own problems, that we don't want to dig into other people's. What I've seen happen during the pandemic is that when people ask you how are you doing, there has been more of a sense of I'm actually interested in how you're doing. There's been more camaraderie in the question. There's been more willingness to say I'm having a bit of a tricky day today. So how's work? Yeah, it's going well, but I can't get my head in it today. I'm distracted by what I'm seeing on the news or whatever it is. We're far more open to listening, and I think part of that's because of the physical distance between people, even if not the social distance. But I think that there be a lot of effort put into having those uncomfortable conversations. I remember distinctly having one line manager who at the end of every quarterly review, we'd go through the standard sheet of how have you hit these objectives, how do you feel you've been doing this, that and the other, and very congenial conversation, no issues at all. And then at the very end of it, the question is, so do you have any advice for me? And yeah, I could give you advice for days, but how much incentive do I have to provide you with advice right now? I mean, I've got my marching orders. These are the things I know I need to work on, and that's fine. And I do wonder if that, closed loop, the OPQ 32, where you're getting input from all around you. We don't do that enough. We get those insights from leadership, from reports, from our peers. And I do wonder if there's something in that does talk to sort of that hierarchy versus equality argument. If we look at hierarchies around the world, tend to mimic the, shall we say, the white privilege that exists, and often the patriarchy that, like it or not, still has a place within society. I was at Cranfield Venture Day last year, and there was a conversation about we need more women into STEM subjects and into universities and doing engineering and maths and technology. That's what sat there at the back thinking, actually having got a background in chemistry, yeah, there was a bias towards men in graduate chemistry, but there was a much higher bias at PhD level and then definitely beyond. And you start looking at that, and it's the engineering of the systems, and the systems weren't equal. You're looking at there are certain biological time go on, and there are certain psychological contracts we make with how comfortable we are with being on short-term contracts or not, and I firmly believe that the society and the hierarchy has developed to it perpetuates many of the inequalities. And I think this exactly the same happens in organizations when you're looking at safe spaces. And therefore, then when you're trying to build a safe space for people to actually have an opinion, they end up in that sort of more transactional theory of a parent-child, because, hey, there's a boss, or there's a superior, or there's somebody that, even if we are equals, that I respect because they have a certain position, or they're, letters before or after their name, or whatever it is. We end up building our own hierarchies, our own mental models of hierarchies anyway. And I wonder just how much it crushes our ability to then actually feel comfortable expressing our own opinions and deep-rooted fears.
Jutta.
I think it's a muscle.
This is your
Yeah.
This is your world. Yeah.
I think this is a muscle. And I thought it was bloody eloquent how you argued this, Matt, because learning to be comfortable with things that are uncomfortable is by definition something that we have to learn. And it is like a muscle that we develop through physical training. And I think the really important practical thing about that is we can't require somebody who's lower down in the power hierarchy to become comfortable with uncomfortable stuff before we, who are higher in power or status, lead. Like we do a vulnerability lead, right? We say that in psychology, or, we have to have the emotional courage to lead and show that it's legitimate, that it's okay, that it's acceptable, that we don't crumble when we're revealing something that we're uncomfortable with, so that it becomes more normal and normative for people below us in the hierarchy to even dip their toes into conversations that are uncomfortable. When I teach this to my students, I give them homework to do one thing that they're uncomfortable with every day, like a mental muscle. So for many of my students who are brilliant and who are on the spectrum of thinking, problems are their own problems, who are trying to solve everybody else's problems, they're uncomfortable with saying no, for example. They're uncomfortable with maybe being perceived as being less helpful. But whatever it is, depending on where you are in the power hierarchy, and I really respect what you're saying here, Matt, about, patriarchy and the world order, as it were, it has to start at the top of the world order for people to show that being uncomfortable can be comfortable, and having the courage to say, I'm inviting you to be maybe critical of me. I'm inviting you to give me feedback that I find difficult to deal with. And that's how it can cascade downwards. But that is a muscle. Adam.
Psychological safety and leadership. The general hypothesis is that it's lonely at the top. How can you feel safe at the top without leaning on power? That's another session.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, like just listening to this. It's this construct. And again, like with everything that's happening globally at the moment, like, the last 5 years have kind of led us to this point where there's a lot of stuff going down, and the commonality between it. If I'm thinking Hong Kong, I'm thinking UK, I'm thinking United States, I'm thinking, all over the world. It's the challenge is the hierarchy, or the hierarchy is the commonality, and the way power is used through that. And as I think about what I'm starting to take away from this conversation, there's a couple of things. We started to touch on the point of listening and the art of listening. Recently, I was put through a very brief exercise. In groups of 2, you each grab a chair, you sit on the chair, and you face back to back. One person will speak for 60 seconds. And for that 60 seconds, the other person who's not speaking must listen attentively. However, They must commit, 100% commit to verbalizing every thought that is going through his or her mind. And I'm like, I can listen. I can do this. Sat down. Away we go. Person A starts speaking about flamingos. I like flamingos. They're pink and they do these things. And I'm thinking, bird, water, Bolivia, marshmallows. The word marshmallow came out of my mouth because I thought pink, marshmallow, pink, similar shade. And as I'm doing this, I'm then going, I'm actually articulating, like, what's up with my brain? Like, why am I thinking unrelated things to the conversation that someone is asking me to listen? Like the brain, how it, I learned a lot that day about what it means to listen. And I know that I've got a lot to learn. And I thought I was a good listener. It's how do you still the brain and truly harness what people are saying and what they mean, without your interpretation of what it means. Oh, the color of a flamingo is same as a pink marshmallow. What value is that giving? And to your point, Jutta, is that if we're in a meeting, we're going around the table and we've got equality and most importantly, respect at the center of this. So we've removed the hierarchical structure, whether it be organizational, patriarchal, governmental, whatever, social, economic, and just go, no. As you say, the person sweeping the floor may know something, may know the answer, may have a different slant on this. Listen, truly listen. I think where my brain is now starting to land on this is kind of, I think it's a little Venn at the center of this conversation, which is listening, respect, and care. If we help people to build the muscle of listening, respect, and care in the spirit of equality, and then in comes a ludicrously ambitious idea, but it's not being barked at us because we're leading with these three principles. Would we not by default get a higher buy-in to successful execution? Or if not, better ideation refinement, better risk mitigation, better capability development, better resource allocation, better everything? Because what we're doing is we're teaching people how to listen, how to respect something that is not in their own mind, and how to lead with care. Because, I know I'm guilty of, when I hear someone speak, my brain is spinning fast because I'm like, oh, but this and that and that and this, and it's running away. How do I silence that? How do I actually listen? Because if I can master that and put that at the center of, this topic of how do we actually kind of bring those things to life with collections of other people, surely this has to be one of the keys that helps unlock that lock.
I love it, what you're saying. And I have one thing to add on top of it based on what Matt was saying, and one thing to reply to you. We don't silence our mind. It's not possible to silence our mind. Our minds go off and wander. That's what minds do. And we are talking about listening, respect, and care, which I think is brilliant, by the way. Not because we're pink and fluffy, not because we care about marshmallows or flamingos, and we think we need to be cozy and comfortable and friendly with each other. We're doing this because we're trying to pinpoint data that can help us make better decisions and that can help us translate good ideas into action, right? We are data hunters. We are hunters for which is the idea or which is the execution strand that will get us to go to B and A. But what you're saying, it sounds a bit pink and fluffy, doesn't it? Listening, respect, and care. That's definitely the path towards getting to that data item that you can't afford to miss, right? And in terms of working with our mind, going off into all sorts of tangents, we want to be aware of those tangents because they could lead us into a good direction, but we surely don't want to quash them down. We want to acknowledge them. We want to notice them in order to create a bit of distance between ourselves and getting entangled or maybe hijacked by the thought that I like flamingos, I dislike flamingos. Why am I thinking about pink and marshmallows right now? I want to notice and separate myself from all these thoughts. And that's where I want to be democratic, because at that moment, all thoughts are equal, all thoughts are valid. And only afterwards,
that's
when
nice.
you guys come back, do we then start to sift through which ones are the golden nuggets. But before I lead on to Matt, I want to add to your 3 things: listening, respect, and care, what Matt brought to the table. Being comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. I think that's a really important addition that I'm taking away from this conversation, Matt, that you've brought to the table, because it reminds me of this parable, this tale of the prickly porcupines. I'm not sure you know the tale of the prickly porcupines. Prickly porcupines in winter, porcupines with big like quills, huddled together because it was really cold and because they were seeking warmth. And then as they were huddling together to seek warmth in the winter, they started to poke each other, and they started to realize that huddling together is really painful. And even though they were warm, they just hated that they kept pricking each other, they kept hurting each other by being close together. And so they thought, sod that, we're going to go back out into the cold, into the winter, because I don't want to keep being hurt by this uncomfortable pricks, right? Sorry, I'm being politically correct, hopefully. But the moral of the tale is that as they dispersed and separated again, many of them died of the cold because it was the coldest winter ever. And so the ones that learned that going back into those shelters and living with each other and huddling together, even though their quills kept pricking each other, kept making them feel uncomfortable, realized that it was better to be together, and they could withstand the uncomfortableness of these prickly quills. And in the end, they not only survived, but they thrived, and they developed the best idea ever. So that's why I'm saying uncomfortableness, comfortable, is really a useful addition. And I think it's probably overlooked too much. Matt?
Well, if you go to flamingos, they have long legs. So I'm not really a marshmallow guy.
Fair enough.
I still come back. I think some of the first things that was said, which is about translation. But after everything we've this journey we've been through, that's not anymore about translating the strategy into my context. It's about actually translating it into something that has meaning, and that allows me to have to be comfortable with that uncomfortable idea. It's about translating it through a level of caring and having people that are willing there to listen, because communication is two-way. I think one of the biggest mistakes is that we assume that we speak and somebody listens, understands. Computers all the time that there's a feedback loop that, we put bits in computer code, so that if we send a code down a telephone wire or over like we are doing right now, there's a message that comes back to validate what's being said. I still go back to Cranfield and look at the ladder of inference, and how you may say to me and I may interpret it in 1,000 different ways. You may tell me that my microphone sounds well, and I all of a sudden think that it's my voice. Well, actually, it's just because I forgot to change a setting on the, in Zoom somewhere. And so I think that this for me comes back to it's more than translation. It's actually about being able to kind of just be able to reorient yourself with the person, with each of the individual people speaking with, that you're looking to go on a journey with, that you're looking to implement a change with, and no longer to lead a change, but to actually try to catalyst for it.
To move in sync, reorient ourselves to move in sync towards where we want to go. I love it. Thank you.
Nice. This has been a good one. I like this a lot.
Thank
We're
you.
getting good at this. The strategy behind. And there's more to come. Yet again. That is now the official catchphrase of how to finish these sessions.
But there's more.